I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the Disney movie Aladdin. So as a refresher, it's the story of a poor, handsome, always handsome, right, young man who falls in love with a beautiful princess and overcomes obstacles in order to gain her trust and her father's approval to marry her with the help of a little magic, namely a genie in a bottle. I don't love everything about this patriarchal storyline, I'll have to say that, but it's still entertaining, and it serves as an excellent introduction into the parable we're going to look at today. So what do you remember about Aladdin, this character? He's a survivor, right? He steals in order to eat and to feed the poor. He tricks people in order to get ahead, to get what he wants. He has no qualms about using deceit in order to do something good, or to take out his enemy, or to advance what he wants to do. He's the classic underdog who, using his wit and his charm, climbs his way to the top and defies the limits of his socioeconomic status. He's not a villain, not nearly, but he's definitely shrewd. Shrewd is a word like it can be cunning, it can be using trickery. It's sort of wisdom but with a twist, almost. Using wisdom but with a twist. Some might call his ways practical wisdom and applaud his efforts, and others might find fault in them because he is actually deceiving people. It depends who you are. The judgment is yours as the audience. So eventually in the movie, the truth comes out, right? And he gets the girl, and they live happily ever after. And you see that his shrewdness paid off. And that's the way the world works so often. Jesus' parable about the dishonest or the unrighteous manager seems to teach the same thing. This is how the world works. But as Jesus tells this story to his disciples, the people who are already committed to following him, he's also handing them some wisdom. This story and the statements he makes right after are meant to shape them, to help them see, to lead them on a good path, what's good for them, what's good for the world. And the same is true for us. He's also speaking to us, his disciples today. So, without further ado, I said that last week actually, that's lame. Let's get some wisdom, shall we? I'm going to be reading from Luke 16, starting in verse 1, if you'd like to follow along in your Bibles. Let's read it. So Jesus says to his disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him, and he said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Turn in the accounts of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' And the manager said to himself, 'Oh, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I'm removed from management, people may receive me into their houses.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and sit down and quickly write 50. And then he said to another, 'And how much do you owe?' And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness." I was trying to think of a good comparison for what this manager was in charge of in today's context. And I quickly realized that pretty much any industry where there's production and material and invoicing and payments on a larger scale could work. So think of a large-scale farming operation or a ranch in Yellowstone. Or think of a large-scale building company that does commercial projects and builds multifamily units on multiple sites. I'm smiling at Tim. That's what Tim does for work, or was doing. And then think of the owners versus the top management. So the people that the owners have put in charge of their company. And you'll get a picture of what Jesus is describing here. This could actually, I was thinking this could actually be made, this story could be made into a screenplay, and it probably already has been in like an episode of Suits or something. Okay, so in this parable, it comes to the owner's attention that his manager, the one who's been in charge of his whole estate, has been wasting his possessions. He's been mismanaging the owner's assets. Maybe he doesn't care about the owner's profit, or maybe he's lazy or self-serving, or maybe he's just not smart enough to manage an estate. Regardless, there is just too much waste. He's not a good manager. And the owner confronts him and fires him from his position. Before the word gets out, the manager jumps into action, recognizing he's not strong enough to do physical labor, and he's way too proud to beg. I was thinking about this. His position has been an esteemed one, right? Like he's managing this multi-whatever company, and he's probably had good pay, and he probably has a good pension and a place to live. And can you imagine all of that suddenly being ripped away and having to ask people for help with nothing to offer in return? That's what he was looking at. So he schemes, and he comes up with a plan. He's going to make friends out of his master's debtors by reducing what they owe the master. That way, they're going to owe him money, or at least be so grateful to him that they welcome him into their homes once he's out on the streets. So this is a picture of like pure self-preservation. He is literally looking out for himself. So he calls up his master's debtors, and he asks them how much they owe the owner. He should know this, right? He should know how much they owe the owner. This is evidence of his mismanagement. One debtor tells him he owes the master 100 measures of oil. That's like about 875 gallons of oil. Another says he owes the owner 100 measures of wheat, which is about 1,100 bushels of wheat. Also a huge amount. These things should have been collected by the manager as well. So first of all, he doesn't know how much these guys owe him, right? Second of all, he was the one that was in charge of collecting what they owed, and he didn't. Again, he was a bad manager. So the manager tells them to quickly take their invoices and reduce the amounts they owe, cutting the amount of oil in half and cutting the wheat by 20%. So he reduces their debt significantly. He essentially blesses them in order to gain their loyalty and trust. And when the owner finds out, he actually commends the manager for his shrewdness, Jesus says. He applauds him, which catches us off guard as listeners, as hearers, as readers, right? Why would he approve of this obviously unethical act that keeps the master from getting everything that was owed to him? I was thinking about this. I think he probably approves of it because the manager finally took action and made a good business decision. He gave the debtors a break in order to build loyalty and trust. It was a smart move, worthy of some admiration. This doesn't mean that he gets to keep his job. He's proven incompetent and unreliable and now disloyal. But still, good for him for making some friends while he still could. That scoundrel. that's the sense that you get, right? Kind of like Aladdin, right? That scoundrel, but man, he did it. The story ends there. But according to Luke, Jesus isn't finished. There are some lessons here, some important takeaways that he wants his disciples to hear and understand. Now, this parable is different from the parables that we've looked at so far, because the parallels that have become the norm that we're usually looking for, like the master as God and the servant as us, as disciples, those parallels aren't really there, or at least we're not drawing them. Some scholars do draw them. We're choosing not to. We're not hearing Jesus say, this is who God is and this is who we are, the same way that we've been hearing him say that. Instead, we're hearing him say, this is how the world works. Jesus is making an observation. Right after the parable, Jesus makes 7 statements. And so we're going to read them starting in, it's also starting in verse 8, just the second part of verse 8. So I'm going to read them for us. He says, here's the first one. For the sons of this world, of this age, are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And then he says this next one. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Then he goes on to say, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who's going to entrust you to the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is someone else's, who will give you that which is your own? And then he makes these next 2 statements. No servant can serve 2 masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. And then the last statement, you cannot serve both God and money. So these 7 statements are lessons that he's attaching to this parable he just told. It's interesting, right? These lessons aren't exactly obvious when you think back to the parable, at least not for me. It took me some mental gymnastics. I was working it out, and it was hard. But as I was realizing, as I was trying to figure out how they connected to the parable and how they connect to each other, I realized something. These statements that he's making kind of function as observations, just like the parable itself. Like, this is how the world works. That's the kind of sense that we get in these statements that Jesus makes. And then I realized that these statements are actually sort of functioning like proverbs, like the ones we find in the book of Proverbs, which basically point out the same thing. This is how the world works. And this is what wise living looks like as you live in it. So I wonder if this is what Jesus had in mind as he told this story and made these statements. We don't know, but I wonder. We're going to jump into Proverbs just briefly to create some context, and then we'll come back to these statements that Jesus makes. So Proverbs is a book of wisdom, we're told, and chapter 4 starts with a father telling his son to listen to his instruction in order to gain insight. He, probably Solomon, says this, son, what I'm telling you to do is good. Don't forsake my teaching. This is what my father told me. Let your heart hold fast to my words, keep my commandments, and live. And then Solomon tells his son bluntly, and I love this, get wisdom, he says. Get insight. Don't forget and don't turn away from the words of my mouth. Don't forsake her, that's wisdom, and she'll keep you. Love her, and she'll guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this, Solomon says. Get it. Get wisdom. And whatever you get insight. So if you're familiar with Proverbs at all, if you would look at chapter 10 all of a sudden, which my bookmark, oh no, here it is. If you would look at chapter 10, it says, it kind of starts the individual Proverbs. You know how there's all these little wisdom nuggets basically throughout Proverbs. So those start in chapter 10. It's like this collection of Solomon's Proverbs, and it goes for 20 more chapters. So I'm just going to read the first verses, the first 10 verses as an example, and then I invite you to be thinking about what Jesus was doing with his own statements as I'm reading them. So just listen. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. Treasures gained by wickedness don't profit, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord doesn't let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest is a son who brings shame. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. The memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but he who makes his ways crooked will be found out. Wisdom. This is how the world works, and this is what wise living looks like as you live in it. As we look at Jesus' Proverbs then, what does he want us to see and understand? What's he calling us to know or to do even? In the first one, he makes an observation that is directly tied to the parable. He says, "For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light." He's making a comparison here between those who make business decisions for their own gain or self-preservation, so they're using what they can to get ahead, and those who act out of their integrity and tend not to. And he seems to be saying that being shrewd, which is a sibling of wisdom, but with a touch of trickery, like I said, in this world, so being shrewd is a good thing. You get that sense. And then he says this. It's like he's commending the manager, too, even though his actions were dishonest. So we get that little statement. And then I think he explains what he means by the second statement, and he's offering some advice. He says to his disciples, "I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings." So the word for wealth here is mammon. You might have heard of this word before. It means in Greek like money, possessions, and property. That's the sense of it. Unrighteous mammon was apparently a Jewish idiom, which just means it was used all the time, kind of like you would say filthy rich, like that kind of sense. So it's the unrighteous mammon, that's the idiom. So he seems to be saying that his disciples who are children of light could or should be a touch more shrewd. It seems like he's encouraging them to do that. Like use money and possessions to gain friends. Bless people with it, just like the manager did, so that when it fails, because it will, you can't take it with you, you will have gained friends for the life beyond this life. That's what he seems to be saying. It's like he's saying that what we do with our mammon, with our money and possessions now, counts for something beyond this life. His third observation is this. So this is his third statement. One who is faithful or trustworthy in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest or unrighteous in very little is also dishonest or unrighteous in much. So Jesus is talking about character and integrity here. He's describing two kinds of people. He's saying you can be one or the other, but you can't be both. It's almost like he's handing his disciples a litmus test, a way to tell what's at the core of themselves, or maybe others, or one another even. What is actually commendable? It's being faithful, being loyal or trustworthy. You can think to the Old Testament for a second. Being faithful for Israel, that's one of the major themes in the Old Testament. And being faithful included like upholding the Ten Commandments, for example. It really included, like loving God and loving neighbor. That's what being faithful was. Israel failed at that a million times, right? In a million ways. But that is the sense that we're getting as we are looking at Jesus naming this is faithful and this is what is dishonest or unfaithful. You wonder, as Jesus' statement comes on the heels of his encouragement to use your resources to gain friends, if he's saying that being faithful is doing that. I'll say that again. You wonder, as Jesus' statement is coming on the heels of his encouragement to use our resources to gain friends, if that is actually what he's saying is being faithful. So I have a vivid memory of my mom saying this statement to me one time. So the one who is faithful in a little is also faithful in much, and the one who's dishonest